Another property that is very important when it comes to CSS Grid is justify items. And justify items, and the default is right now stretch. So that if I refresh this, nothing's going to change. But if I do start and refresh, it aligns the contents in a grid item along what we call the row axis. So the row axis is each row. If I do end and I refresh, we see that they're now towards the end. But a better way to visualize this is to actually use our developer tools. So if I go to View, Developer, Developer Tools, and we select our grid, you see that by clicking on this pointing icon and hovering over it, in Google Chrome, we actually see our grid system. And if I scroll, you see that it actually stays in place. But you see that we now have our items at the end of our grid system. Our last item, which is 2FR, right over here, is justified to the end. Our second column is justified to the end, and we see a bit of a gap here. And that is because, remember, we have 1FR. And then the first item, because it's auto and the size is according to its content, doesn't really move. Whether we have end or start here, it's already within the maxed space of the grid system. And just like we have the axis around the row, if I change this to align items, and I save and refresh, this one's hard to see, so let's just do 5 or 300 pixels and refresh here. We see that align items is the exact opposite, where it's around a column axis. And we can use start end here to move those grid boxes around. But most of the time we want this filled and we don't want to move items around, so I don't really like using those two properties. So let's fix that to 1FR. If I refresh, all right, we have things back to normal. I'm going to close this. Now, the last thing I want to show you inside of this container is my preferred method of actually creating a grid layout in any website that I built. And what I usually like to do is something new that we haven't seen before. I usually do repeat and define here how many rows I want. Let's say I want 3 at 1FR. So I want everything to have the same size. But there's a problem here, right? Because right now, this is stretching, but as soon as we make it too small or too big, it's not extremely responsive, or it's not 100% responsive. So instead, I like using autofill. And in autofill, just to show you what it does, if I do something like 300 pixels and I refresh, and now I change the sizing, you'll see that our grid system or the column system adjusts autofills according to the size of our viewport, which is really, really nice. But right now, I just said 300 pixels. So again, it's not super, super responsive. So instead, we can use something else called the min-max. And I know this can look confusing, but if you remember this pattern, this is the most common pattern I would say to use when it comes to CSS Grid. So once you get used to this, you can just copy and paste it and use it everywhere. And here, what we want to do is say, well, the minimum that we want the size of our columns to be, let's say I want the minimum to be 200 pixels. So that's the smallest it's going to get. The max though, how big do we want these to get? And this is a common thing. What do we want as the biggest? Well, just 1FR. Because as we will see, by doing this, it'll automatically adjust to the size of the viewport. Let me just save and show you what I mean. If I refresh here, I see I have 3 here. It auto adjusts based on our size. But you also see that the container itself is also adjusting in size. So that if I go smaller and smaller and smaller, look at that. As soon as we hit the 200 pixel minimum, it adjusts. And because we set 1FR as the max, as soon as the viewport is really, really small and goes below 200 pixels, it's going to just take up one fraction. And in our case, it'll be the entire screen. So using this syntax of repeat autofill min-max, giving it a minimum, we're able to make this completely responsive. And as you can see here, it's pretty powerful, right? In just a few lines of code, we've made this grid system that is completely responsive. All right, up to this point, we've just focused on the container. But what about the individual items? What if we want something that's maybe bigger than the other item, and we don't want them all symmetrical like this? What would we do? Let's find out in the next video.